My apologies to Peter and my colleagues. I'm a writer, and the thought of speaking off the cuff without prepared remarks is terrifying to me. And I also didn't really communicate that well with Peter beforehand, which is my fault. So I'm going to read some remarks. I couldn't speak as articulately as you just did, but so bear with me. Again, my name is Doug Hill. I'm going to start with a quote from John Dewey, who was, for those who don't recognize his name, he was a leading American intellectual scholar in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And in 1899, Dewey wrote that democracy requires, quote, tools for getting at truth in detail and day by day as we go along. Without such possession, it is only the courage of the fool that would undertake the venture to which democracy has committed itself. And then I'll read a couple of current quotes from people that you will recognize. One is from Donald Trump. Just remember, he said, what you're seeing and what you're reading is not what's happening. And another from Mark Zuckerberg, identifying the truth is complicated. I am going to, where we are today affirms again the genius of Jacques Ellul and his prescience. In 1954 in the Technological Society, he wrote that distortion of the news represents the first step toward a sham universe, a step that would lead us inexorably to what he called the disappearance of reality in a world of hallucinations. I use those words as the title of a paper I presented on Ellul's thought on propaganda at the 2014 Ellul Society conference in Montreal. And what I'm going to do now is share some of the key points I made in that paper with addition from, if I have time, from one recent article that appeared in the New York Times. David, perhaps you could give me a signal if I'm headed over 15 minutes or 10 minutes left. Thank you. Again, back to Ellul's thoughts on propaganda. Most of us think that propaganda is something we don't like, that we don't want to be subjected to. To the contrary, Ellul said, propaganda achieves the power it has precisely because we so desperately need it. Propaganda helps us maintain our senses of identity and self-worth in an environment in which, thanks to technique, our confidence in those crucial convictions are under constant assault. Quote, there is not just a wicked propagandist at work who sets up means to ensnare the innocent citizen, Ellul wrote. Rather, there is a citizen who craves propaganda from the bottom of his being and a propagandist who responds to this craving. One of Ellul's central arguments is that human beings are, quote, diminished, close quote, by life in technological society. Quote, never before has the human race as a whole had to exert such efforts in its daily labors as it does today as a result of its absorption into the monstrous technical mechanism. It may be said that we live in a universe which is psychologically subversive. That I think you will recognize as a central conviction of Ellul's. He added that excessive data do not enlighten the reader or the listener. They drown him. He cannot remember them all or coordinate them or understand them. If he does not want to risk losing his mind, he will merely draw a picture from them, a general picture from them. He wrote that in Propaganda, which was published in France in 1962. As pressing as our need for information management might be, Ellul described a far deeper need that propaganda satisfies, the need of individuals living in the technological society for reassurance of their value as human beings.
Propaganda offers us an antidote to our diminishment, he said. It tells us that we know things, that what we know matters, that we matter. As Ellul put it, propaganda justifies us. Bolstered by propaganda, he said, the individual can look down from the heights upon daily trifles, secure in the knowledge that his opinion, once ignored or actively scorned, has become, quote, important and decisive. He marches forward with full assurance of his righteousness. I'm going to skip the article from the New York Times I mentioned for time's sake. It has to do with the emergence of a new scholarly specialty called the examination of what is called adaptive reality. And it examines the proposition that we are indulging more and more in what they call deliberate ignorance. And I think you can gather some sense of what that's about. But let me go back to propaganda. I'm going to skip down. I can't speak off the cuff, but I can edit off the cuff, and I will do so now. Ellul wrote about a much broader, I mean, we think of propaganda as something that's specifically directed toward us, messages intended to sway our opinion. But Ellul wrote, I found very interesting, about what he called sociological propaganda. And this is the broader sociological consensus that Emil Durkheim called collective representations and Thomas Kuhn called a paradigm. Ellul describes sociological propaganda as a progressive adaptation to a certain order of things, a certain concept of human relations, which unconsciously molds individuals and makes them conform to society. It is, he added, a sort of persuasion from within. The aggregation of aspirations in mythology known collectively as the American dream created a set of expectations centered around beliefs that if you work hard and follow the rules, you are entitled to a certain degree of security and social position in addition to a comfortable lifestyle. When those rewards didn't materialize or when they evaporated, the result was copious anger and a desire to punish those responsible. I think it's clear that a lot of the anger and resentment that we see surrounding us today has to do with that kind of resentment. I'll conclude with that Ellul, in his book Propaganda, was uncommonly frank, skeptical, and at times really angry about the self-deception he witnessed. And again, this was in 1962. Quote, democracy is based on the concept that man is rational and capable of seeing clearly what is in his own interest, that the study of public opinion, he wrote, but the study of public opinion suggests this is a highly doubtful proposition. He went on to say that we are responsible, all of us, for a commitment to a discernment of reality. When we surrender ourselves to propaganda, regardless of where it comes from or what it's advocating, when we fend off reality in order to reinforce our preconceived ideas of what is and what should be, we're guilty of an ethical failure. A person who does so is convinced, Ellul said, quote, that he himself, his party, his class, his nation are right, that they represent good and justice. It is this conviction that is decisive and which effectively sways man into the field of propaganda. He called such a set of beliefs auto-justification and condemned them unequivocally. Quote, all ethical behavior seems to me to imply a questioning of self, a reassessment, and the acceptance of one's values being questioned by others, he wrote. It is the price that must be paid both to measure oneself to the value and to have a possible relation in truth. Thanks.
Actually, I'm comfortable anywhere. Well, before coming to this conference, I was rereading some books by Jacques Ellul, and one of them was Political Illusion. And you know what astonished me? Actually, what Ellul wrote there were dozens and dozens of years ago. The situation has radically changed. The world is different now. We have new types of media. We have new types of technologies. But this guy, he's still guiding our thought. I guess Political Illusion deserves rereading and rereading again, in the same way as Propaganda or any other work by Ellul. Say, when I read Propaganda, it was 1992. I read it together with Technological Society. At that time, we were in the midst of very new illusions, In 1989, Berlin Wall cracked. In 1990, Lithuania and other Baltic states became independent, There were these famous concepts, which I now think were extremely erroneous, Before that, there was The End of Ideology by Daniel Bell. What do we have today? We have proliferation of ideologies. The whole world became even more ideologized than it was 30, 40, or 50 years ago. Then there was this guy Fukuyama with The End of History. Everybody was applauding. By the way, some 10 years ago, I tried to contact, and I wanted to sit down and revise with him, but he refused. He refused to talk. And I think it's a shame because I wanted, to understand how he views these things now. On the other hand, now I would say we live in a very strange time. We don't believe any longer in some previous illusion, but we continue implementing these illusions. Let's take, for example, the illusion that the future belongs to democracy. Okay, I believe in democracy, but how do you make it work in a contemporary world? How you bring it to other continents, to other cultures? I remember there was this guy who was a Hollywood star. He was Egyptian, Omar Sharif. And he used to talk to people. He said, you think that you can bring democracy to Arabic nations, but it's not possible because these are tribal people. You cannot bring democracy to Afghanistan. Well, my own country was involved in these military restorations, but nothing much happens. We also continue to be erroneous in many other ways. I think at the end of his life, the world system theorist and sociologist Immanuel Wallerstein, he was staying at Yale University at that time, and he was writing regular columns. I remember he said, you should not listen to what politicians say, but what politicians do. But we continue listening to what do they say. And actually, it is not important any longer what do they say, because they are telling the same things that are not in any way related to truth, to reality, and whatever. And in Political Illusion, Ellul writes, let me quote, "In fact, values no longer serve as the criteria of judgment to determine good or evil. Political considerations are now the preeminent value, and all others must adjust to them." Now, I come from a country which is not relatively close to some things that are going on in the world, to this Russian and Ukrainian war. And I've been experiencing the change in political discourse. For example, now in Lithuania, it's not possible not to take sides. And when I try to say that, it's the things that are going there are much more complex and complicated than simply good and the good guys and the right guys. These are geopolitical problems. This is another, so to say, stage of Cold War, which once again became a hot war. And without understanding these things, you cannot in any way solve the problem. For example, media now in Eastern Europe and in Lithuania, Poland, and other countries say, we have to go and Ukraine has to win the war. Let me say that I'm pro-Ukrainian. But I don't take this, because how can you win a war with a nuclear country, which is far stronger, you know? But this belief is going on. And what also really bothers me, that people say that, well, the war should go on and so on, but any war finally ends in some peace. In the world history, I think the longest war was in England. This was 100 years war, when finally, at the end, there were two camps, two people who got together, and they realized there were too few of them to continue, so they disbanded. Also, I think why Ellul is becoming even more important than ever. Say, if you take his propaganda. Well, in 1992, when I read propaganda, I said, well, what the guy is talking, you know, propaganda and democracy. It's communist state, it's fascist, totalitarian states who make propaganda. It's not democracies. But now, I guess we realize that propaganda is a global phenomena. And democracies use propaganda. Now, there is also a belief that somehow these new technologies are making us more free. But when you go to Facebook, or I dropped out of Facebook 10 years ago, because I realized that you must have an opinion, and an opinion that is popular. If you don't have this opinion, you'd better stop or go away. There is one more thing, but the answer comes not from Ellul, but actually there was this Italian philosopher, semiotician, and writer Umberto Eco. He said that even very intelligent people who are prominent in their professions, they apply this thinking. They think that if I am good at what I am doing, I'm equally good about my political judgments. And actually, when they transpose this kind of thinking, what happens is that very intelligent person who is maybe a historian or business leader or university professor, he makes the same judgment as a common ordinary people. And partially, this is because we are all under the influence of media. Marshall McLuhan, years ago, he said that, I guess if I remember right, that illiterate people do not succumb to propaganda. And Ellul eventually elaborated on this when he was discussing how Chinese communists came into power. There was no centralized media, there was no radio, there was no TV in China, but the communists won because they knew how to break the society, how to keep the people outside the families, outside their, so to say, these very strong community relations. And they indoctrinated. In 10, 15 years, the country was different and the communists won. So unfortunately, I don't have recipes. I have lots of questions. But to end, I believe we should continue by asking and not taking anything for granted, whatever media or politicians say. Thank you.
Okay. My first question is for David. When do you think Joe Biden will drop out of the race?
I didn't mean to put a chill on that question. We can certainly talk about it.
No, it's all right. I have really, I have no statement per se. I have a series of questions that I'd like each of you to if you have a response, to respond to.
Louder. Speak into the mic.
Oh, is that what this is? Okay. A series of questions which I'm just going to throw out, and perhaps you have some thoughts on them. Technology, communication, political dysfunction. We're talking about this because we all believe that right now we're in a moment of profound political dysfunction. What is it possible that we've been in a position of profound political dysfunction for at least the last 35 or 40 years. And now it's starting to break. Until the rise of digital media and the internet, our mass media are the perfect medium for propaganda. Centralized control of the flow of messages, creation and the flow of messages. All of a sudden, other voices come into the mix. Propaganda, as Ellul describes it, is an environment of almost infinite redundancy. Narratives reinforcing other narratives, all coming from, if not the same source, 4 or 5 very, very similar sources. All of a sudden, that is, if it's not immediately broken, there are chinks in the armor. Other voices are coming out. Scary voices, entropic voices, alien voices, voices that make us uncomfortable, voices that make us raise our voices against them. And what if that's the way it should be? I can't help thinking that all of the rhetoric we're hearing today about the dangers of social media and the dangers of the digital information environment and the dangers of those dangerous messages that are coming to us is like a reaction formation from the technological society. It's like, don't look at the man behind the curtain, listen to us. Or as Groucho Marx said, who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? And I wonder if you have any thoughts on those thoughts.
I think when you think about the arc of the last 40 years, right, there's no single moment where the media landscape changed overnight, right? It's been a series of overlapping developments. I'll just speak about the US context because that's what I know the best at this point. But for example, in 1987, we repealed the Fairness Doctrine, right? That, like back when I was a boy, the news broadcasts had to make an effort to air both sides of an issue or to give equal space to both political parties to present their case to the public, right? And when the Fairness Doctrine was repealed, right, it opened the door to the rise of entities like Fox News and also like a certain incarnation, I guess, of MSNBC, which I don't necessarily think is equivalent to Fox News, right? At least you can imagine it becoming so. And we created a media environment where, for the first time in a long time, we had openly partisan media sources starting to dominate the news environment, right? With, I think, like fairly predictable effects on people's news consumption and people's political attitudes, right? Like there's been a lot of scholarship about, okay, so what's the difference between a voter who spends a lot of time watching Fox News and a voter who doesn't? I mean, a Republican voter who spends a lot of time watching Fox and a Republican voter who doesn't, right? And you can see significant sort of ideological and policy differences between somebody who consumes a lot of this media and somebody who doesn't consume a lot of this media. And I think that that's worth noting, right? And I think the point that you made at the beginning was really about gatekeeping, right? And like what's behind the gate. When I started off in the study of digital media in the early 2000s, this was the time period where the energy in the digital world was on the left. There were a lot of people who were starting blogs. I'm thinking of like things like the Daily Kos, right? And the founder of that website wrote a book called Crashing the Gate. And there was a lot of enthusiasm, almost jubilation, about the way that digital media had allowed us an end run around the media gatekeepers and would allow us all to produce our own content and to have our voice heard by as many people as we possibly can. And I think what's been shocking to people over the last 20 years or so is exactly what's behind that gate. Exactly what it is that people believe And the way that these newer technologies, these social media, can be harnessed by malicious actors to drive people into whatever direction they want to drive them. I don't think that was necessarily anticipated. I mean, there were some people saying it in 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, right? There were voices. I was in this like tiny little corner of political science where we met in a section called the Information and Communication Technology section of the American Political Science Association. Okay, and you could have fit us all in like 1/4 of this room. We were a little bit weird in our own discipline. But there were certainly voices cautioning us, saying like, look, first of all, authoritarian regimes are going to figure out how to leverage this stuff to get what they want. You know, we're living in a moment where the energy is with the dissidents, right? The energy is with people who are trying to dismantle power structures, but the power structures will figure it out. And I think that has really been borne out over the last 10 or 15 years, where you have you simply have a new set of gatekeepers keeping you from certain kinds of information and feeding you certain kinds of information. But I'm not somebody that thinks that social media has like necessarily broken all of our brains, because again, I think it has been a long process. Like I'm thinking back to like Neil Postman talking about how you can read an entire 45-minute news broadcast in like 3 minutes on a piece of paper. And that, you know, that long-term diminishment of people's ability to process deep information, to sit with a text and read it for long periods of time. You know, this is something you hear even among professors, right? Professors are like, I don't know, I haven't read a book in 5 years, because it's just, I don't have the attention span anymore. Like I sit down with a book, I'm not talking about myself, by the way. Absolutely not, I read tons of books. But you know, you sit down to read a book and then your phone chimes and I've got to tweet something and my wife is texting me and I got my family group chat and my college group chat. Like there's so many sources of interference with our ability to sit down and process information and to really think about what we believe and think, that I think it's making that deeper reflection much harder. And it's making it much easier to just take our cues from like a different set of gatekeepers, right? And in the US, those gatekeepers are partisan media, explicitly partisan media. And the algorithms of social media that I think reward certain kinds of outrageous content and punish things that are more thoughtful. I mean, I just can tell you from working in the media space for about 8 or 9 years now, when I send a headline to an editor that I think is like a thoughtful, you know, a thoughtful encapsulation of what I've written, it will almost always be sent back to me in a different form that is designed for search engine optimization, you know? And so it's like you can write a piece that like issues a bunch of caveats, and it's like, I don't know, like this could go either way, like I'm thinking really, you know, this is a tough question. And the headline will say like, Biden must drop out or we all die. You know what I mean? Like on my own article, right? Which I do happen to believe that, but anyway, I'll to answer the question, yeah, he really needs to drop out. But so anyway, I'll stop there. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but I think when we do take that broad sweep of recent history, I tend to think of like our dysfunction as being the product of unleashing forces that we don't really understand that well, colliding with a lot of sort of like profit incentives among media to stoke that fear and outrage to get the clicks that gets the money coming in, right? And there's too many people who don't necessarily recognize that and also see in that outrage things that they themselves have been feeling about the failures of our society. And I mean, I think like another thing that is causing this moment of deep danger for democracy is the fact that like we have experienced 20 or 30 years of dysfunction. Right? We have experienced 20 or 30 years where our political elites, like more frequently than not, are not actually trying to solve problems. They're trying to win the next election. And that has produced a situation where the most prominent issues that Americans tell pollsters that they care about in public opinion survey research, these things have so rarely been addressed by Congress and by our political system, or even by state governments, that people have started to throw up their hands and be like, well, is anybody going to stop the hospital from charging me $800 to hold my baby. You know what I mean? Like, is anybody going to do something about that or no? Right? Like, it cost me $10,000 to have a healthy baby last year. I didn't have a baby. I'm married. So, that's crazy, right? Like, there's a lot of things that happen in American politics that don't make any sense, that cry out for solutions, and our political elites have like failed time and again to deliver those solutions. And I think that opens up space for demagoguery and ideologues and people who are promising simple, easy solutions to either return things to the way they were or to bring into being like a new, much better reality that you can't just like wave a magic wand and fix the healthcare system, right? It requires careful deliberation. It really requires cooperation between the two parties in our system, and we're not seeing that. And I think that failure to address festering problems over and over and over again has produced that, it produced the climate where people in 2016 were like, I don't know, let's see what happens, Like, how bad could it be? Okay, we're finding out, right? But I think that's where we are.
Just a couple quick comments. Do I need to push a button on this? Hear me? I'm always struck by one of the comments that Ellul repeated often, which is that at a certain point, a change in quantity becomes a change in quality. And this explosion of media that we have experienced in the digital era is a change in quality. It's a fundamentally, I think, different situation. Dewey, the quote I read from Dewey in 1899, could not have imagined it, nor could have Ellul, I think, even. Well, he probably did imagine it, actually. He seems to have seen everything. But this overwhelming tidal wave increases the need to choose your source, as we know, and you have addressed that. I'm a traditional, my career has been in journalism, and I'm a traditional journalist, and I believe that a lot of the traditional media get a bad rap for being fake news, and I find it completely ironic and disgusting that Trump talks about fake news when in his recent trial for the Stormy Daniels situation, it was revealed that he had a paid-for collaboration with the National Enquirer to literally manufacture stories that would attack his opponents in the primaries and in the election. And as we all know, by far the most prolific producer of fake news is Donald Trump himself. And as apologies, but my prejudice, I wear my prejudices on my sleeve as regards Donald Trump. So I'm sorry if I'm offending anyone, but I do think that we have to make a choice to offend people when this kind of situation emerges. I have always also, we have a sacred tenet in American democracy, in the Constitution called the First Amendment and free speech. And I noted during Trump's trial, during the gag orders, so-called, that were issued about his attacking people in the courts, it was often noted that Trump had the perfect right to say whatever he wanted, and including lies. He didn't have to tell the truth. And there's nothing, he just had to avoid or refrain from attacking specific people who he might endanger with his comments. But we're all endangered by his comments. And I have been, I have bowed at the altar of free speech forever, but I'm beginning to wonder, and this is, a heretical statement from a journalist, maybe we need to have some mechanism in this society to call people out for overt lies. And I think, by the way, this fake news business goes back to the great Rush Limbaugh, a favorite, by the way, of Clarence Thomas, among many other people who are on the right now. And as Al Franken said, and called him in his book on Rush Limbaugh,
I can't remember the title, but he called him out as a liar. And a big fat idiot, yes, but he said a liar's liar or something. He was emphatic about the fact that this guy was not telling the truth and that people were listening to him. And of course, I would see bumper stickers from Limbaugh, drivers who were followers of Limbaugh saying, I don't believe the lying media and that sort of thing. So it's been a twist. And again, I think that a lot of the so-called fake media, such as the New York Times, they have standards. They tell the truth and they correct when they're wrong. I have been really shocked in the last, ever since the infamous debate, at how overtly the New York Times has come out in favor of Biden stepping down, which is a clear, they have really gone further than I ever expected they would in, we're not being objective here. We're stating an opinion, and it's coming out in the news columns. There every day is an article about how many people how many Democrats are calling for Biden to step down, and they have editorialized that he should step down. That's a change, but we're at a point of change, and I'm going to just stop by referring to the talk that Langdon Winter made yesterday about what are the solutions and the problem with solutions, and I'm a very big believer in the irrevocability of unintended consequences. And I can't imagine how we can establish a truth commission, some board that examines overt lies by public figures and points them out in a credible way that says this is simply not true. I mean, the Washington Post has been documenting Trump's lies ever since he came into into politics, and they're in the thousands, and there's dozens a day at this point. So I don't know what the solution is, Langdon. I don't have one, but I wish there was a truth commission that we could believe in that would call these people, and excuse my language, on their shit. Thanks.
I feel the need to say that, it's dangerous to say certain phrases and words right now, and you're going to be called a conspiracy theorist or a MAGA head or whatever. But I am a firm believer in our mainstream media as being the greatest purveyors of fake news in our culture right now. It's not to say that they lie. It's not to say that they lie. They just set for us an agenda of certain ideas and issues that we can discuss and ignore the rest. And then they give us a choice. You can be on this side of the issue or you can be on that side of the issue. And that will get plenty of discussion. We're in a place right now where, and I just looked this because I was in a discussion with someone about this, the plurality of the American voting populace are independent right now. 28% identify as Democrats, 28% identify as Republicans, and what does that leave? 46 identify as independents. Not a majority, but the plurality, COVID brain, plurality of American voters right now don't agree with either party. They're not talking about, those parties are not talking about what most Americans think should be talking about. And so, of course, our political system is not going to respond to the issues that don't get addressed through our mainstream media. And rant.
Can I respond just quickly to that? I agree with what you said. I didn't mean to imply that the mainstream media are, the great purveyors of truth, and I think you put it very well that they define a certain agenda that goes back to the sociological propaganda that Ellul talked about, and I agree with that. And that, outside opinions, so-called radical opinions, often are not,
what I was talking about is they don't, in their news coverage, they do have standards about not telling overt lies, and I think you acknowledge that. But it's important. I didn't want to come across as a worshiper of mainstream media, and I acknowledge that it's very important to have alternative voices.
I don't think that actually we had ever a golden age of media where things were okay. But I guess what happened during, say, recent 25 or 30 years, actually Neil Postman was warning when he wrote Amusing Ourselves to Death. And actually what happened is that the whole media, especially all these new medias, they became forms of entertainment. And phenomena of your candidate Trump is actually was made by these media. Recently we had a local politician in my country who was actually playing a clown. But he was so amusing that recently people elected him to the European Parliament. He was kicked out of the national parliament, but now he goes to the European Parliament. I remember some 10 years ago or a bit more, I was having breakfast in a low-budget Bangkok hotel, and there was a TV screen in front of me, and as I was having breakfast, I was watching this. And there was a quite well-known English journalist interviewing a woman. The name didn't say me anything. I thought maybe she's an actress or some model or whatever. So when I got back home, I asked my students, I said, guys, do you know this name, Kim Kardashian? Oh, yeah, yes, we know. So I said, is she an actress? No, she's not. Is she a model? No. So who is she? Oh, she's nobody, but she's famous for being nobody. I know, okay, this is a joke, but now when you look, say when 25 years ago I was teaching as visiting professor here in Chicago at UIC, and my liberal friends were talking about American politics, and they say, well, one of the biggest problems is, these radio preachers, right-wing radio preachers who have huge amounts of people, 15 million, and they are brainwashing them. But, I think when somebody has a wrong argument or a bad argument, you can still talk back. You can talk to people and try to convince them, try to change them. But how can you approach and convince anybody now, who are brainwashed by influencers, who are simply brainwashed by the most stupid people, and they like that? Things were different 20, 30 years ago, and I guess what actually we lost these 20 or 30 years because it came to the universities. 2 weeks ago, head of my department called me and said, well, we should make the titles of our courses more amusing, because students want that, for example, if somebody teaches medieval literature, it's not amusing enough. So you use maybe dwarfs and gnomes or whatever, and so on and so on. Well, it's nothing bad about the titles, but finally it comes about the content as well. And I guess this is now extremely complicated because on one side you have this amusement culture everywhere in the new media. It's coming to the universities. On the other hand, you have such phenomena as cancel culture or whatsoever. So you are not even allowed to debate certain things. In UK, they were canceling, say, famous feminists who were liberating the UK culture 30 or 40 years ago. Now these guys get cancelled, and really I don't know how to act and react in this time. But we have to learn somehow how to deal with this situation, how to deal with these people or who are just voting. There are very many things about which you simply cannot vote. Now, contents of journals, of TV programs, they are judged by votes, by ratings. If you have high ratings, you continue. If you have lower ratings, you drop out. But a lot of serious talk and serious discussion, they are getting outside. They are being cancelled because of that. They are not enough amusing, or that they influence only a kind of small number of people. And I guess our journalist departments have to learn. They are not at the moment. They are not doing the job, because everywhere, the standards of journalism are getting lower and lower with each particular decade. We cannot go with some very stupid prefabricated ideas, because people need to understand. Say, 25 years ago, U.S. were bombing Belgrade. There were discussions, there were demonstrations on the campus, students were protesting against the bombings. There were also arguments for bombings, because what was going in Serbia, it was also a horrible thing. And I remember I did not have TV, but I wanted to know what's going on in Europe, so I would go to these local bars where people get beer and watch TV. And when they were watching these news, they were cheering, And I asked, guys, do you know where this Belgrade is? And the answer was, well, it's somewhere in Europe. And why? And I tried to provoke them. Why US are bombing them? The answer is, well, they are the bad guys. And I mean, this is simplification. This is simplification of very serious issues. But now the majority of people are happy. We live in the culture that people are happy with very simple, so to say, replies. But I don't think we can go on, because then we will be coming to a society which is depicted in dystopias. Just take any Aldous Huxley or George Orwell. It won't be this kind of communist dystopias. It will be very different. It will be more amusing dystopias. But this is where are we basically going on.
All right. Why don't we? Do we still have runners? Do we still have runners for the mics? Any volunteers? Any young people?
We have two.
Yeah.
Y'all. Could I ask a question?
Yeah.
So
You have to run while you're doing
I'm
it.
in the Boston area. We just had a very famous, it's going to be famous court case, a murder trial in a town that split a city apart. And it came down to a Google search, whether a Google search was done at 2 a.m. or 6 a.m. And you would think that'd be pretty easy to find out. And the prosecution and the defense just got different digital experts that said one was at 6 and the other said one was at 2. And the case ended in a mistrial. And what came out was the Bill of Rights mattered more to all the witnesses and the defendant than anything else. And in the Technological Society, Ellul says the one thing that is resistant to technique is not, he didn't even say Christianity, even though he was a theologian. He said it was the law. The law is especially resistant to technique. So we can talk about US politics, that'd be fine, but I'm curious in Lithuania or Egypt specifically, and I'm not trying to leave you out, Doug, but from a geopolitical perspective, do you find the law in Lithuania and Egypt, which not government, not politics, being resistant to technique or propaganda?
So that's a great question. I think, I don't study Egypt as closely as I did 10 years ago. I made kind of a pivot. But what I saw when I was there, right, was a government that allowed the law to be pushed by technique, right, but not toppled. Right? Like they had what we call it in political science is like a safety valve, right? And so a lot of authoritarian regimes, like Egypt, I don't think this is the case anymore, right? Egypt is a much harder authoritarian regime than it was 10 years ago. But circa 2007, 2008, 2009, what the government was doing was what it thought was allowing people to express a certain amount of dissent kind of outside of the boundaries of the law without necessarily punishing them for every transgression, you know? And the regime in Egypt at least miscalculated, right? Like it miscalculated because there was an exogenous event, the Arab Spring, that eventually toppled the dictatorship briefly, in large part because of the information space that they'd opened up for their own dissidents, thinking that they could keep closer tabs on them, right? And what has happened in a lot of authoritarian countries since 2010, 2011, is that the Arab Spring is seen as a cautionary tale. Right, like this is what happens when you allow too much dissent. Like this is what happens when you open up the system. And there's a saying in Egypt is like better 1,000 years of tyranny than a single day of chaos, right? And I think a lot of people, a lot of elites in the region think about that time period and they're like, well, that was really bad actually, right? Like, so we tried democracy and it didn't work, so now we're going to go back to this other thing. And so I think they have reconfigured the authoritarian operating system to be less, not completely intolerant, but like less tolerant of dissenting voices. And they understand, I think, the way that social media can take an event that would have taken weeks or months or even years to turn into something bigger, and that can happen overnight. Right? And they've learned from that. So I'll stop there and turn it over to my colleague here.
I have just a question about the scale at which you're talking about politics, because we're thinking Trump and Biden and NATO and Serbia and all of that, but why don't we think also about politics as being something local and small? Like, I live in Oakland, California, a very dense urban area with lots of problems, but my block that I live on, we all know each other, all 42 residences, some new, some old, and we organize ourselves to for earthquake preparations. Daniel Saraswell's done amazing research on local gardening projects on empty lots. So it seems to me like there's another level of politics where maybe it is, where it does continue to have life, and maybe part of our problem is we don't emphasize that enough to people, but we all keep looking toward those media stars and those big programs. Discuss.
Agreed.
I'd like to respond to that in a way, and it's not at all to disagree with what you're saying. I think Ellul was saying think locally, or think globally, act locally, if I'm correct.
No, it was
Say again?
it was Donald Keys.
Sorry about that. I'll stop trying to quote him. I've been doing some research recently by the Canadian scholar Charles Taylor. And I think that one of the things that he writes about a lot, which applies to this, is the disengagement of the population of the Western democracies. And I obviously am thinking mainly of the America. He talks about and this has to do with the flood of information that's overwhelming us, and goes back to Neil Postman's amusing ourselves to death, and the convenience culture that capitalism has cultivated in our culture. Taylor talks about the buffered individual, and the buffered individual is basically disengaged from active involvement in the ways that you obviously experience in your neighborhood. But I think a lot of people aren't obviously, the statistics of people who don't vote or don't pay attention to politics are, remarkable and alarming. And again, my prejudice is showing that I find it very difficult to understand how anybody could believe and support Donald Trump as a politician if you have any discernment about about reality. I just don't get it, and I'm sure I'm not alone in that. So there is that necessity for local action, and I think that would be a source of optimism, but I think we have to be realistic that a big part of what we're dealing with now is the disengagement of people from truly from reality in a lot of respects.
Ernst Fritz Schumacher, the author of this famous book, Small is Beautiful, or Economics as if People Mattered, when he was approached by people, most of them were absolutely disappointed by his answer, by his reply. He said, "What should we do?" And his answer was actually in the same vein as David says. So he said, try to find the people who are thinking like you, and try to make some local action, But individuals, they want something big. They want big picture, They want something that's going on. But I think the only way how to resist this kind of situation we are now is just to talk to the people whom we can call community, or whom we can call neighbors, or people who are engaged in the same way like we are talking and exchanging our opinions. This is the only way, because all other solutions are mainly technical ones, and technical solutions are no solutions at all.
I'll try to be brief, but I guess I want to stand up for people a little bit and put some of the blame here on developments in the local media environment. Like, I have a colleague named Josh Dar who studies the contribution of the elimination of local news sources to partisan polarization and sort of the growth of authoritarianism. When I was a kid, there were two newspapers delivered to my house, right? One in the morning was the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the other was a newspaper that was specific to South Jersey, the 51st state. It was called the Courier Post, and it no longer exists because, like a lot of smaller newspapers and regional newspapers, it went belly up with the disappearance of ad revenue and the rise of all these other media sources. And as those local media sources have dried up, so has the coverage of local issues, right? So has a sense that things that happen in your neighborhood are just as important as who the president is. Like your local school council, right? And traffic calming measures that you put into place on your street. And it's been very difficult to finance those operations, right? To make them viable. And at the same time as you have that happening, you have the consolidation of local broadcast media under the guise of single corporations. I'm sure you've seen one of these supercuts of the Sinclair media operation, where they synchronize their broadcast. It's you're in Pittsburgh and you're effectively watching the same broadcast as somebody in Ohio, because the corporation has synced up its messaging and has asked its talent to do this. And it has systematically deprived us of information about our own communities and interest in our own communities. And it has when those sources retreat, we fall back into this pattern of looking at everything through the lens of national politics. And I'm as guilty of that as anybody else. It is the thing that I happen to care about. I used to do a radio show where the host would, he would ask, I remember one time he was can you name more than 2 people running for the mayor of Chicago? And there were at least 12. And I was I cannot, right? Because I wasn't paying attention. And I think, we can blame people for the media choices that they make and not being discerning, but I think we also have to think about the structural media environment in which they exist. And that structural media environment is giving people exactly what they want to give them. And that thing is not a sense of community. There are organizations that have sprung up to fill this void. There's little gazettes for every neighborhood in Chicago that exist online. You go write for them, you go read them, and they're great, But I don't know that they've necessarily filled the void left by the closure of even major urban newspapers, right? That's something it seems like we've not figured out how to make vital local journalism financially viable, so that people can access different things and can think about different things other than whether Joe Biden is dropping out of the race.
David Lovekin. Oh, so I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Would someone get a mic to David then?
The delocalization of news, delocalization of life through malls, through virtual shopping, I think are part of a larger project of the divestment of identity. In 1949, Aldous Huxley wrote to his former student, George Orwell, and said, you know, you nail us with 1984, but this conditioning through pain, you know, he had already written Brave New World. He suggested that in the next years, it would switch to something like that scenario. He said the ultimate revolution is one where people come to love their servitude. And if we look at the proliferation of consumption culture, advertising, children being exposed to 5,000 ads a day, 88% of the last study I saw a few, 10 years ago, always having the desire to buy something. So if you buy something now, it doesn't go away. And adults, less than that, but still very high. If we think of this process of the divestment of identity as a kind of stimulus response promise, each one of which empties you out. 1 and 2-year-old children spending 2 hours in front of screens, the excrement of life. It looks to me like this is a kind of the project, the society of the spectacle that Guy Debord mentioned, that is a totalitarian divesting of ourselves, our humanity, our local lives. That seems to me, I mean, what does politics mean for consumers who have been divested of everything except that life is consumption? What's the place of these kinds of factors of consumption culture, for example?
I'd like to respond to that. Is this on? Can you hear me? That's really an essential point. I really thank you for making it. The totality of what we're surrounded and the sea that we swim in is definitional. And as was mentioned, I'm writing a book on Max Weber, and his version of technique was capitalism. And I think there's it's hard to distinguish between the two in terms of what you're talking about. There's to cut through that. We hear a lot of talk today about how can't we all just get together and can't we find a way to get together and talk and share. And I think one of the things that T-Bone Burnett talked about last night are sort of implicit in his comments and sometimes explicit, was we're in a fight. This is a battle, and we have enemies, and they are the people that are, and the institutions and the capitalist organizations that are purveying the kind of consumerist ideology that you're talking about and that we're surrounded by and defined by in so many ways. They have ways of stopping, as Ellul said, you can just go so far and then we'll shut you down. We like to let a little dissent through just to let some of the steam off. But I don't think we should kid ourselves. As T-Bone Burnett is taking up arms against the enemies of art, and I think we all have a responsibility to take up arms in one way or another. And I don't have key solutions, but I think to have rosy ideas about, well, let's all get together and we'll be okay, it's not that simple. This is a real battle that we're in, and I think we need to acknowledge that. So thanks for letting me sound off.
David, look.
I have 2 words: fake news. And thus I repeat myself. Hegel wrote in his miscellaneous writings that the morning newspaper had replaced the morning prayer. And the really always interesting question is, what is reality? And I think we're still thinking about what McLuhan meant when he said the medium is the message, because I don't think it much matters what's on television what's on or in the fake news. What's important is whatever's in there is what is true. And it might be what I believe or whatever, but there needs to be some kind of sense of standard, which means that a person has to have a self. And I think one of the huge problems in the technological society is the lack of a sense of self. And how do you get a sense of self? By struggling with otherness. And what is the media? But typically collapsing the other into the known. And that's what's present before you. And thus I go back to fake news.
Almantas, I was in St. Petersburg as a high school student in 1991, and I was able to visit some elementary schools and saw the actual propaganda that was given to children, the way Lenin was spoken about as a divine figure and things like that. A question for you, it seems to me that type of propaganda is very different than what we're talking about here. And I wonder if it's even the right word to use, what we're speaking about here. But I put that to you because to me it almost seems like we're just talking about a critique of capitalism here. But specifically on the nature of propaganda, you grew up, I'm guessing, with exposure to some of this, and I'm just wondering, do you see it different or do you see it the same?
Oh, a very difficult question. But, well, I would say, I spent 27 years under so-called communism, which was anything but communism, yeah? It was a totalitarian regime, but I would say, and I come from family, my uncle spent 10 years in Gulag, and he could have been buried there, but he managed to get back. So back in the Soviet times, it was easier, because you knew that you are right about some things, and they were values, they were family values, they were family stories. Things like that. I experienced, by the way, something of the kind when I visited Iran on 2 occasions. And I stayed with families, and I heard their stories about Shah's regime, about the new regime, what happened to people, how they suffered, and so on and so on. So in these circumstances, to resist propaganda, I would say it's relatively simple, because there are a lot of people who are thinking like you. The problem is that you can't say much. Or you have to use a coded language. You cannot talk openly, you communicate. But now we live in an absolutely different culture, and I would say that some of the categories we are used, they are wrong. For example, this category of fake news. I don't think that fake news is a problem, because if if somebody tells a lie, you can debate, you can prove that this is a lie, but we live in a culture of bullshit. And the problem is that you cannot debunk bullshit, because it's all around. Bullshit has no substance. It simply goes there, it catches you and everybody is involved, And in this situation, it's very difficult, to have an opinion, even to have a certain standing, because supposedly, you live in a kind of liberal state, and you don't need to prove or fight anything at all, at least in the popular consciousness. So, to cut a very long story short, I guess it was easier then than it is now. I guess we are in much more complicated situation for a number of reasons.
So I have a question. The topic of New York Times came up, and their potentially overt editorialization of the current political moment. And it strikes me that as a platform with international reach, there is a lot of benefit to an organization like the New York Times in a moment of very deep moral implications, speaking out and saying something. And yet at the same time, I think there's also the potential for that to further polarize and drive a sense of binary thinking in a place where it might not actually be very binary. So I'm curious to hear your opinion on what role, if any, or responsibility does a news organization like the New York Times have to avoid editorializing the news, and what your take would be on their current editorialization of the Biden moment.
you know, could I say something? There's a wonderful new book last 2 or 3 years by a scholar by the name of Kate Eichhorn, and it's called Content. It's a very brief book. It's maybe 100 pages. It's about 3 by 5. But she talks about all the ways news really, in a sense, doesn't exist. The New York Times is not a news organization anymore. They are a content distribution organization. And the content, once we start valuing information as a sellable commodity rather than something that enlightens and enriches us, the value of that information is going to fall, and it's going to become content. I personally think that the Times op-ed urging Biden to step down was kind of twofold. One, it's what the readers of the Times wanted to hear, and two, it's what I think, whatever powers there are that motivate the technological society also want this message out there. That things will go smoother under a Biden than under a Trump. And that's my thought.
Well,
Are we done? Okay, well, we got to wrap it up in we have, I think, 4 minutes. Is that close to being correct? 2 minutes? All right, well.
Sure.
Then thank you guys, Almantas, Doug, David, and of course, David. And thank you all.
Yes, thank you to everybody. I'm sorry to kind of butt in, but we have to move along. We have a coffee break, and after our coffee break, we're going to have our grand experiment in can we follow directions? Because we're dividing into 3 groups. You decide where you want to go, but the A track will meet in here. The B and C tracks will meet upstairs in 2 classrooms. Just follow the stairs or take the elevator up there. Let's try to get there on time so we can start. And if you're a speaker or a session chair or a timekeeper, get there early to try to make sure it's set up. Before you leave the room, though, I want to introduce Catherine Graber, who's the director of the Ellul Special Collection at Wheaton College. Come up here, Catherine. And you guys hang on up here so we can hear from Catherine. Just say hello.
Hello, everyone. I'm Catherine Graber. I'm one of the archivists at the Wheaton College Archives and Special Collections, where we hold a Jacques Ellul collection. And I look forward to speaking with you all and sharing a little more about the collection.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Catherine, for coming over for the day. We have a table set up with these things and a few examples of things from the archive. But if you're going to be doing research, doing your dissertation or writing a book on Ellul, a lot of it's digitized, a lot of it's accessible over the internet. But paying a visit to the archive is really the next best thing to going to Bordeaux and asking Daniel and Anita Saraswell to show you around. So have a good break, and we'll see you in these 3 groups shortly.